Hello, friends, and welcome back. I hope you're all doing well by God's grace. Let's start the final part of the episode. Please like this video and subscribe the channel. The courtroom had crossed a line no one could walk back from. Robyn sat frozen, her hands trembling, her breath uneven, cornered, exposed, unraveling. For years, she had stood beside Cody, defended him, trusted him, protected him. But now she turned. Her voice cracked through the silence. He's the mastermind. The words landed like a bomb. Cody shot to his feet instantly, rage erupting from him like a storm breaking loose. She's lying, he thundered. I never made her do anything. But Robyn didn't stop. Tears streamed down her face as her shaking hands rose, her voice breaking yet determined. You think I could do all of this alone, she cried. You think I had that kind of strength? A pause. Then the truth, raw and devastating. He was there. Every step. He told me the others would turn against us. He said the house was our safety, our future. The courtroom gasped. Reporters leaned forward, pens racing across paper. Cameras clicked like rapid fire. The air thickened with disbelief. Meri's voice cut through it all, cold, sharp, undeniable. It doesn't matter whose plan it was, she said. They built it together. And now they're tearing each other apart to survive. The judge raised a hand. Present the evidence. Robyn's lawyer stepped forward, placing a stack of documents before the bench. Your Honor, he said calmly, these are text messages between Robyn and Cody Brown. A screen flickered to life. And then, the truth spoke for itself. Keep it between us. They'll never understand. This is our future. What if they find out? Then we lie. The courtroom erupted. Shouts. Gasps. Chaos. Cody's face flushed deep red, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. That's out of context, he snapped. I wasn't talking about, but no one believed him. Because the words were there. Clear. Damning. Unforgiving. Robyn's voice broke again, softer now, but heavier. He said if I didn't do this, I'd lose everything. The room fell silent. It was never about love, she whispered. It was about control. The trial shifts, everything changed in that moment. This was no longer about suspicion. No longer about accusations. This was exposure. Cody tried to fight back, his voice rising again, desperate, angry. She wanted that house. She pushed for it. But his words collapsed under the weight of his own messages. The prosecutor stepped forward. Mr. Brown, do you deny sending these texts? A pause. A crack in the armor. I don't recall. The courtroom groaned. That was enough. Robyn broke down completely. I didn't want to do this, she sobbed. I didn't want to steal from the family, but he said it was the only way. The narrative had flipped. The untouchable man was now standing in the fire. The darker truth, but the worst was still coming. The prosecutor turned back to Robyn. What was the real purpose of the house? Robyn looked up, eyes red, voice trembling. It wasn't for the family. A pause that felt endless. It was for us. Just me and Cody. The courtroom exploded again. He said we could leave everything behind, start over. No Meri. No Janelle. No Christine. Just us. Meri's face hardened instantly. All those years, she said quietly, preaching about family, and you were planning to abandon us? Cody shook his head violently. That's not true. But once again, his own words betrayed him. We don't need them. As long as we have the house, we'll be fine. Silence fell like a hammer. The illusion was gone. The truth stood naked in the center of the courtroom. Session ends, but war begins. The judge's voice cut through the wreckage. This court will consider all evidence presented. A pause. But these allegations go beyond fraud. He lifted the gavel. They suggest conspiracy. Bang. Court is adjourned. Newspaper outside. The world explodes within minutes. Headlines flooded every screen. Robyn betrays Cody's secret escape plan. Exposed marriage turns to war in court. Inside the courtroom, Meri and Janelle sat in silence. Not celebrating. Not reacting. Just steady. Because after years of being unheard, the truth was finally speaking for them. What comes next? But the storm wasn't over. Because the next session, Cody would strike back. And what he reveals would destroy Robyn even further. The next morning, the courthouse felt heavier than before, as if the walls themselves carried the weight of what had already been revealed and what was still to come. Rain poured steadily outside, drenching the steps where reporters had gathered in overwhelming numbers, their voices echoing into cameras as headlines from the previous day spread like wildfire. Inside, the courtroom was unnaturally still. The usual murmurs had disappeared, replaced by a thick silence filled with anticipation. Everyone knew that this session would not be calm. It would not be controlled. Today was about retaliation. When the judge entered and called the court to order, all eyes shifted immediately. Robyn sat at the defense table, pale and visibly shaken, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as if holding herself together. The emotional toll of her previous testimony had drained her completely. But behind her, Cody was no longer the composed man he had tried to be before. His anger was visible now, simmering beneath the surface, ready to erupt. When the judge acknowledged him and granted him permission to speak, the tension in the room became almost unbearable. Cody stood slowly, his movements deliberate, his expression hardened. His voice cut through the silence with a sharp intensity as he began to speak. He acknowledged the accusations that had been thrown at him: conspiracy, deception, betrayal, but quickly turned the focus. If Robyn intended to bring him down, he made it clear that she would not go alone. His words were cold and calculated as he declared that she was not the victim she claimed to be. The courtroom reacted instantly, a wave of shock spreading through the gallery. Robyn's head snapped toward him, her fear immediate and visible as she tried to stop him, but he refused. He was done protecting her. Without hesitation, Cody introduced the first set of documents. A thick folder was handed to the judge, and as its contents were reviewed, Cody revealed that these were records of debts Robyn had concealed long before the house was ever part of the story. Credit accounts, unpaid loans, defaults, years of financial deception that had never been disclosed. He emphasized that this was not a recent mistake or a single lapse in judgment. According to him, it was a pattern that stretched back years. The courtroom responded with audible gasps as the weight of his claim settled in. Robyn denied it through tears, insisting it was not true, but her voice struggled to carry against the rising disbelief in the room. The prosecutor stepped forward to reinforce the claim, confirming that the debts were documented and verified by financial institutions. This validation shifted the atmosphere further. What had once seemed like a complicated situation was now becoming something far more deliberate. Robyn attempted to explain herself, saying she had acted for the sake of her children, but the justification felt thin against the mounting evidence. The perception of her role in the situation was changing rapidly, and not in her favor. Cody continued without pause, escalating the situation even further. He introduced another piece of evidence, stating that the truth went beyond financial dishonesty. This time, he claimed Robyn had also deceived everyone about her loyalty. He presented email exchanges between Robyn and a private attorney, communications that, according to him, dated back to a time before the house was even discovered. When the judge inquired about the nature of the attorney's involvement, Cody delivered the most damaging revelation yet. The attorney had been hired for custody matters. The impact was immediate and explosive. The courtroom erupted in shock as Cody explained that Robyn had been planning her exit long before any of this surfaced. He claimed she had been preparing custody arrangements, intending to take the children and sever ties with the family entirely. Robyn broke down under the weight of this accusation, her denials overwhelmed by the reaction around her. She insisted she had been afraid, that her actions were driven by fear, but the explanation struggled to regain any sympathy. Meri responded first, her voice controlled but cutting, pointing out the contradiction between Robyn's public image and the actions now being revealed. Janelle followed, emphasizing the imbalance between what they had endured and what Robyn had been secretly preparing. Their words didn't need volume to carry impact. They were steady, grounded, and firm, and they reinforced the growing sense that this situation was no longer about misunderstanding, but about calculated decisions. The courtroom began to feel unstable, as if the balance of the entire case had shifted. The prosecutor questioned Cody's timing, asking why he had chosen this moment to reveal such critical information. His answer was immediate and emotional. He claimed he had protected Robyn for years, carried her secrets, and absorbed the consequences of her actions. But after her betrayal, he no longer felt any obligation to remain silent. If she intended to expose him, he was prepared to expose everything. The judge attempted to restore order, bringing the gavel down firmly, but the emotional damage had already been done. The courtroom was no longer a place of structured argument. It had become a battleground where personal betrayals were unfolding in real time. Robyn, overwhelmed, pleaded quietly for Cody to stop, but his response was cold and final. In his eyes, she had initiated this collapse. As the session came to a close, the judge addressed the gravity of what had been presented. The allegations now extended beyond financial misconduct, touching on issues of conspiracy and custody manipulation. These were no longer minor disputes or isolated incidents. They were serious claims that would require careful examination. With a final strike of the gavel, the session was adjourned. Outside, the reaction was immediate and intense. Reporters rushed to deliver breaking updates as new headlines formed within minutes, each one more explosive than the last. The narrative had shifted again, and now the public watched as the conflict between Cody and Robyn escalated into something far deeper than anyone had anticipated. Inside, the courtroom emptied slowly. Robyn remained seated for a moment longer, visibly broken, her composure gone. Cody stood apart, no longer defensive, no longer restrained. Across the room, Meri and Janelle remained steady and composed. They had not needed to dominate the session. They had simply allowed the truth to surface on its own, and now it was doing the work for them. The trial was no longer about uncovering facts. It had become a fight for survival, and the next session promised something even more decisive. The courtroom reconvened under a heavier silence than before. There was no anticipation now, only expectation. Because everyone understood something had changed permanently after the last session. The balance of power, the narrative, even the alliances inside the room had all shifted beyond repair. When the judge entered, his expression reflected the seriousness of what lay ahead. The earlier revelations had moved the case from conflict into something far more complex, something that now required absolute clarity. All rise. The room stood. But this time, no one felt steady. Robyn entered slowly, her composure fragile, her eyes distant. The emotional exhaustion from the previous session had left visible marks, her posture slightly hunched, her movements uncertain, as if each step required effort she no longer had. She no longer looked like someone defending herself. She looked like someone bracing for impact. Cody, on the other hand, appeared different. Not calmer, not satisfied, but focused. There was a sharpness in him now, an edge formed from confrontation and exposure. He had already crossed the point of no return. What remained was not restraint, but resolution. Meri and Janelle sat quietly at their table observing. They no longer needed to react outwardly. The events unfolding had already begun to validate what they had long questioned. The judge opened the session with a direct tone, acknowledging the gravity of the previous day's revelations and reminding all parties that the court was now evaluating credibility as much as evidence. He requested that the next phase proceed with structured testimony and verification of claims already introduced. The prosecutor stepped forward first. This phase, he stated, will focus on corroborating the financial and legal documents submitted in the prior session, as well as establishing intent behind the actions described. He gestured toward the evidence table. We will begin with independent financial verification. Documents were presented again, this time with additional supporting records, bank statements, institutional confirmations, and transaction histories that aligned with the debts previously disclosed. As the records were reviewed, the pattern became increasingly difficult to dispute. The timeline showed consistency. The accounts had not been isolated incidents, but part of a broader financial footprint that had gone unreported within the family structure. Robyn sat silently as each page was referenced. She no longer interrupted, no longer objected. Her silence carried more weight than any denial at this point. Then came the second phase of the session. The prosecutor addressed the custody-related communications that Cody had introduced earlier. He called for authentication of the emails and requested verification of authorship and timestamps. An expert witness was brought forward to confirm the digital records. After a detailed review, the conclusion was presented clearly. The communications were legitimate, unaltered, and consistent with the metadata provided. The timeline placed the discussions well before the escalation of the current dispute, supporting the claim that legal preparations had been made in advance. A murmur moved through the courtroom. Not loud, but undeniable, because now the narrative had shifted from allegation to substantiation. Cody leaned forward slightly as the confirmation was read aloud, his expression tightening, not in surprise, but in affirmation. He had already known what these documents contained. What mattered now was that the court recognized them as valid. Robyn finally spoke, her voice quieter than before. "I was scared," she repeated, as if the words themselves might still carry meaning strong enough to explain everything. "I didn't trust what would happen if things fell apart." Her statement lingered in the air, but the tone had changed. It no longer challenged the evidence, it attempted to contextualize it. The judge acknowledged her words, but did not respond immediately. Instead, he made a note and allowed the process to continue. The prosecutor then shifted focus to intent. "Your Honor, the question is not only what occurred," he said, "but why these actions were taken in sequence and whether they indicate premeditation or reaction." He turned to Cody. "Mr. Brown, when you first became aware of these financial discrepancies, what was your understanding at the time?" Cody took a breath. His answer was measured. "I believed everything was being managed. I trusted that the finances were transparent within the family structure." A pause. "I was wrong." There was no dramatization in his tone. No attempt to exaggerate. Just acknowledgement. "And when did you realize otherwise?" "Not until the documents started coming forward," he replied. "That's when I understood the extent of what had been hidden." The courtroom settled into a rhythm of verification, testimony, and quiet realization. Each layer of evidence reinforced the previous one, building a structure that was no longer easy to challenge without contradiction. But beneath the procedural flow, something else was happening. The relationships that had once defined this family were no longer intact, not in perception, and not in function. Every new confirmation widened the distance between the individuals involved. Robyn no longer looked at Cody with familiarity. Cody no longer spoke with restraint toward Robyn. And Meri and Janelle remained no longer as observers of conflict, but as individuals whose past concerns now aligned with the unfolding record. As the session progressed toward its midpoint, the judge paused the proceedings. "This court recognizes that the matters presented today extend beyond financial disputes," he said firmly. "They involve trust, intent, and the dissolution of relationships that were once considered unified." He looked across the room. "Before we proceed further, the court will take a brief recess to allow counsel to organize the next phase of testimony." The gavel struck. Court is in recess. As people began to move, the tension did not dissipate. If anything, it deepened. Because the recess was not an ending. It was a pause before the final phase. And everyone in the room understood what that meant. The next session would not focus on establishing facts already known. It would focus on consequences, accountability, and the final alignment of truth and judgment. And when the court returned, the last barrier between accusation and outcome would begin to fall. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted once again, but this time, it was quieter in a more final sense. Not the tension of uncertainty, not the chaos of revelation, but the stillness that comes right before something reaches its conclusion. "All rise." The judge returned to the bench, his expression now more resolute than before. The case had evolved beyond initial disputes into a layered examination of intent, truth, and accountability. What remained was the final phase of testimony, where implications would be weighed against evidence already established. The room settled. No one spoke. No one moved unnecessarily. Everyone understood that the next sequence of events would determine how the court interpreted everything that had been revealed so far. The prosecutor approached first, beginning with a structured summary of the evidence presented across both sessions. Financial records, digital communications, and verified timelines were all referenced again, not as new material, but as interconnected components of a larger pattern. "Your Honor," he began, "what has been established is not a single isolated act, but a sequence of decisions that align over time." He paused briefly. "These decisions indicate planning, awareness, and continuity." He then turned slightly toward the defense table. "Which brings us to the question of responsibility." Robyn remained seated, her posture unchanged from the previous session. The emotional weight she carried had not lifted. Instead, it had settled into something more internal, more contained. She was no longer reacting outwardly. Instead, she listened, absorbing each statement as it passed through the courtroom. Cody sat across from her, still, attentive, and visibly focused. His earlier anger had not resurfaced. In its place was a controlled awareness, an understanding that the proceedings were no longer about confrontation, but about resolution. Meri and Janelle continued to observe quietly. Their expressions were composed, but their attention was constant. They were no longer participants in the conflict. They were witnesses to its conclusion. The prosecutor then called the next witness, a financial analyst tasked with reviewing the full scope of the documented transactions. The witness took the stand and was sworn in. A series of visual exhibits were introduced, mapping the flow of funds, timelines of account activity, and discrepancies between reported and actual financial behavior. As the analyst explained the findings, the patterns became increasingly clear. The records showed repeated inconsistencies between declared financial positions and documented activity. While individual entries could be explained in isolation, the overall structure suggested coordination rather than coincidence. The analyst avoided speculation, focusing strictly on the data. But the implication was understood by everyone in the room. After the testimony concluded, the prosecutor addressed the court once more. "Taken together," he said, "the evidence demonstrates a sustained deviation from transparency within the family's financial structure, along with documented efforts to prepare for separation prior to public disclosure." He let the statement settle. "At minimum, this establishes awareness. At maximum, it suggests intent." The judge leaned forward slightly, reviewing his notes before speaking. "This court has now heard evidence supporting claims of undisclosed financial activity, authenticated communications indicating legal preparation, and expert analysis confirming patterns consistent with coordinated actions." A pause. "However, the court must now determine how these elements interact within the context of credibility and responsibility." He looked across the room, taking in each party. "Before any ruling can be considered, all parties will be given a final opportunity to address the court." Cody was the first to rise. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he took a moment, long enough for the room to quiet even further. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, stripped of the earlier intensity. "This was never something I wanted to end this way," he said. "But once trust is broken to this extent, there's no way to rebuild it without confronting the truth." He glanced briefly toward Robyn. "I didn't come here to destroy anyone. I came here to understand what happened." A pause. "And now I do." He sat down. Robyn then stood. Her movement was slower than before, but deliberate. When she spoke, her voice carried less force, but more clarity than it had in previous sessions. "I made choices out of fear," she began. "Not out of a desire to harm anyone." She looked briefly toward the judge, then toward the room. "I didn't communicate openly. I didn't trust the process. And that led to decisions that I now see had consequences far beyond what I intended." Her hands tightened slightly. "I can't undo that." A pause. "But I accept that it's been brought to light." She lowered her gaze. The room remained silent after her statement. There were no interruptions, no objections, just the weight of acknowledgement settling across the courtroom. The judge closed his folder slowly, signaling the nearing end of proceedings for the day. This court recognizes the statements made by all parties, he said. At this stage, the matter will be taken under advisement. He looked forward, his tone firm but measured. A final ruling will be issued after full review of the record. He raised the gavel. Court is adjourned. As the sound echoed through the chamber, there was no rush to leave. No sudden movement. People remained in place for a moment longer than usual, as if processing the transition from active conflict to pending resolution. Robyn stayed seated, her expression distant. Cody stood quietly, collecting himself. Meri and Janelle gathered their belongings without urgency. And one by one, the room began to empty. Outside, the story had already taken on a life of its own. But inside the courthouse, something more definitive had occurred. The arguments had been made. The evidence had been tested. The narratives had been challenged and, in many cases, confirmed. Now, there was only one step remaining. The ruling. And when it came, it would not reopen the case. It would close it. The days that followed the final session passed in silence. No more headlines from inside the courtroom. No more interruptions. No more dramatic revelations. Just waiting. Because now, everything depended on one thing, the judge's final ruling. When the court reconvened for the last time, the atmosphere was different again. Not tense. Not chaotic. Decisive. Everyone present understood this was no longer about arguments or rebuttals. The evidence had already spoken. The testimonies had already been heard. This moment was about closure. All rise. The judge entered with a calm, steady presence. There was no hesitation in his movements as he took his seat and reviewed the final notes in front of him. After a brief silence, he looked up. This court has completed its review of all submitted evidence, testimony, and expert analysis. He paused. The matter before this court concerns financial transparency, contractual obligations, and the integrity of communications between the involved parties. The room remained completely still. The judge continued, his tone firm and measured as he delivered his findings. Based on the totality of the records presented, the court finds that there were instances of undisclosed financial activity and inconsistencies in reporting that were not communicated to all relevant parties. A slight shift moved through the room. These actions contributed to a breakdown in trust and created conditions that led to the escalation of this dispute. He turned a page. However, the court also recognizes that the communications introduced into evidence demonstrate intent to prepare for legal separation, as well as actions taken without full disclosure to all parties involved. Robyn sat motionless as the words were read. There was no reaction now, no denial, no interruption. Only acceptance. The weight of everything that had unfolded had already settled within her long before this moment arrived. Cody remained composed, listening carefully, his expression unreadable but steady. There was no visible celebration, no outward sign of victory. Only a quiet acknowledgement that the process had reached its end. Meri and Janelle sat side by side, their posture relaxed but attentive. They did not exchange words. They didn't need to. The outcome had aligned with what had been gradually revealed throughout the proceedings. The judge set the final portion of his ruling in place. Given the findings, this court orders the following. He listed the determinations clearly and without ambiguity, addressing financial responsibilities, clarifying obligations tied to the disputed matters, and establishing the framework for resolution moving forward. This court further emphasizes, he added, that while personal relationships have been irreparably affected, the legal process exists to ensure accountability based on evidence, not emotion. A pause. And in that regard, this matter is now resolved within the jurisdiction of this court. He looked across the room one final time. There will be no further hearings on these claims unless new and substantial evidence is introduced. Then, with finality, case closed. The gavel struck the bench. A clean, definitive sound that echoed through the chamber, not loud, but absolute. For a moment, no one moved. It wasn't shock. It wasn't relief. It was the realization that something long in motion had finally come to rest. The courtroom that had once been filled with accusations, interruptions, and emotional confrontations was now quiet in a different way. Final. Robyn slowly stood, her movements calm, but heavy with the awareness of everything that had transpired. She didn't look around the room. She didn't address anyone. She simply gathered herself and prepared to leave, carrying the consequences of her choices with her. Cody rose as well, but without urgency. His expression remained controlled, his posture steady. Whatever had driven him through the previous sessions had now settled into something quieter, resolution rather than reaction. Meri and Janelle stood shortly after, collecting their belongings without ceremony. Their role in the process had not been one of confrontation, but of persistence. And now, the outcome reflected that endurance. As the three parties exited the courtroom, they did so separately. No final exchange. No closing remarks. No reconciliation. Just distance. Outside, the world had already moved on to interpreting the outcome in headlines, commentary, and public discussion. But inside the courthouse, the matter had reached its conclusion in the only place that mattered for the case itself. The truth had been examined. The evidence had been weighed. And the judgment had been delivered. The doors closed behind them. And with that, the chapter ended not with resolution between people, but with closure from the court. The case was over. The final part is over. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe the channel. Next episode will be coming very soon.